just introduce myself. I'm John Saltzman, Solution Architect at Ascend.io. I'm really excited to be here today with my colleague from Cooperative Benefits Group, CBG, Sean Nieves, who is the Data and Integration Engineer over there. So Sean, it's super awesome to be with you here with you today. Looking forward to this conversation as we discover together with our attendees what we did here with CICD, with Ascend, and with CBG. I think it's really cool and really exciting. So thank you so much for being willing to do this with us. And I'll turn it over to you to get started.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Again, thank you for having me. So what we're going to be doing today is kind of talking about how we remove the human error from production deployments with GitHub Actions. Before I get started, I want to take a look at this quote real quick. It says, "It's fine to celebrate success, but it is more important to heed the lessons of failure." And what that means is we want, as developers, we want to fail because that's the only way we're going to be able to grow. At CBG, we fail fast and we share often. You know, we share with our colleagues, whether it be on Stack Overflow or just sharing in general. As a community, we want to be able to fail and learn from those failures. I failed a lot, so we'll get into that. So as far as our agenda is concerned, we'll give you a brief overview of what Cooperative Benefits Group is and what we do. We'll go into our IT organization and mission, and then we'll dive right into what continuous integration, continuous delivery is, why it matters, and give you a pretty bird's eye overview of what it is. Then we'll get into automating Ascend.io deployments with GitHub Actions. We'll start off with looking at the Python SDK provided by Ascend. And again, this was a critical piece actually doing this. We couldn't have done this process without that SDK. We'll take a look at Dataflow deployment and GitHub Actions. Take a look at some key takeaways and lessons I learned during this process. And then we'll pass it over to you guys for some Q&A. So Cooperative Benefits Group. We are a PBM, which stands for Pharmacy Benefit Management Company, but we're a PBM with a twist. We want to partner with forward-thinking entities that want to be more involved with their members' benefits. We work directly with these plans to understand the concepts and put them on a pathway to own their own PBM. And once we think they're ready, and once they assume that they're ready, then we kind of just parachute out and hand over the reins to them. Within our IT department, we have to be extremely agile. As I mentioned before, our business model is partnering with entities, training them on PBM, and then parachuting out. So we have to be extremely agile. We have to be able to spin up new environments quickly, 100% of the time, accurately. We strive for complete automation with no manual processes. To accomplish this, we follow some key tenets. We treat infrastructure as code. We treat code as king. We have hyperautomation, again, emphasizing no manual processes. We want to remove the human error factor from everything that we do. And we have to, of course, make sure that everything we do is secure and efficient.
And Sean, I had a question for you since being in the healthcare industry. Traditionally, when I worked in the healthcare industry, first started about, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, the healthcare industry was still fairly behind the times in terms of cutting edge technology. I think it obviously has caught up a lot in the last 10, 15 years. But even still, like the approach that you're taking here is still relatively new to a lot of organizations, and not just in the healthcare industry, right? So this is a timely topic, not just with regards to Ascend, but in general around the automation that organizations are doing as they go through the so-called buzzword digital transformation and things like that as well. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And you'd be surprised at the number of companies that we work with that may not have the IT staff geared towards automating certain things. You know, we have with some of the smaller plans that we deal with, they're working on text files still, or Excel sheets, keeping their member population in an Excel file, not even in a database. So you'd be surprised at the vast difference between organizations that are right in line with the times and just way behind the times.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So again, getting into what CICD is, it is continuous integration, continuous delivery, and is essential in an agile environment. It's essentially a practice where you're consistently merging your code on a periodic basis and actions are run on that code to ensure best practices are observed. It also checks on downstream sister applications. We typically merge at CBG a feature branch once a day. In some cases, it's more frequent, but for the most part, we try to stick to that once a day philosophy. The reality is working in isolation can lead to time-consuming collisions or avoidable bugs. So that's why you want to, when you're collaborating with multiple team members, you want to make sure that you're merging your branches frequently, that you're collaborating in almost a real-time basis. Because more often than not doing that will lead to lost time, bugs that are introduced into production that will take your system down. So a number of different reasons why CICD is essential.
And on that topic of organizations kind of maturing, right? CICD is a more kind of mature process as your organization is maturing, your DevOps processes are maturing, you definitely turn to CICD. So being able to do CICD with cloud-based platforms such as Ascend.io is a big deal to be able to apply that technology. Customers that are just starting out with Ascend.io, maybe they're not doing CI/CD, maybe some of the folks that are here today are just starting on that process. So as we go through this more, this will help get you kind of started along that journey if you're just starting out in this area.
Thanks, John. And that's a great point. At CBG, our philosophy is making sure that we have CI/CD involved in all of our process, whether it be a website, ETL, data, anything that we have has to follow that CI/CD process. We merge our branches, we do the peer reviews, all of that. But again, CI/CD allows us to stay lean. We're a small shop, we're a startup, but CI/CD allows us to stay lean while still developing world-class applications at breakneck speeds. Leveraging CI/CD with GitHub Actions allows us to identify potential issues before they even make it to production. We employ a service called Codacy. So when our actions are running, Codacy runs and looks at our code, making sure that it follows certain guidelines, making sure we're following best practices. And if it fails, it'll stop that action right there and kick it back to us. And like I mentioned, all of our code is peer reviewed prior to merging these branches, and it allows us to improve developer productivity, find and address bugs quicker, and deliver updates in a fast and consistent manner.
And as the subject of the webinar kind of discussed too, reducing human error and intervention, speeding up that velocity, that release cadence. I remember in the old days when releases would be, maybe once a year you'd get a new release. And obviously this week or this current time frame, people are deploying multiple times a day sometimes, every week. Right, so the velocity of that is a lot faster, which means that it's more error prone unless you automate it. So obviously you have to put all these pieces together. I'll talk about for a moment some of the elements of designing a CI/CD strategy that are more specific to Ascend. One of the most important things, one of the hardest problems in computer science, right? There's two hard problems in computer science: naming things and cache invalidation. That's kind of a joke. If you Google it, the two hardest things in computer science, those are the two hardest things. So one clarification that I find is helpful for people, it's named in the naming conventions. When you talk about CI/CD, you talk about the life cycle stage of your actual code that you're developing, right? Whether that's development code or it's UAT or it's production and implemented in the production environment, things like that. In Ascend, when you become a customer of Ascend, or if you're already a customer, you know that we talk about your Ascend environment. This is usually your domain name that you type in the browser. So it will be something like, your customer.ascend.io. So if you have customers that have that kind of a deployment where it's just all on one environment, you'll have a slightly different strategy for CI/CD with Ascend than customers that might have multiple Ascend clusters or multiple Ascend environments. Some customers choose to have multiple, so they'll name those things something like customer dev-ascend.io or customer UAT, and their prod will be customer without anything at the end. All of the patterns that we're going to talk about today, and even what CBG did, they work in both scenarios where you may have multiple Ascend clusters that you're deploying to, multiple Ascend environments. But there are differences. If you're deploying on a single Ascend environment, then you're going to have a naming convention that may look something like the data service naming convention, which is the third bullet on this slide. I think, Sean, you're going to actually kind of show us what you guys chose to do for this particular case, where you name the different data services in Ascend to indicate what lifecycle stage those pipelines are actually in.
Yep.
Another thing that's really important when you're implementing this strategy is data service naming. So excuse me, unit of deployment. I'm reading the slide and not actually thinking about what I'm saying. The unit of deployment. So are you deploying a data service or are you deploying an individual data flow? And why would you actually want to do one or the other? Well, when you use a data service-based deployment, Ascend will check dependencies between data flows inside of that data service. For example, if you build a data flow and you have a data feed and you're sharing outputs from one data flow with another, and they're in the same data service. If you do deployment at a data service level, Ascend will figure out those dependencies and intelligently apply changes to your Ascend environment when you're deploying. So if you do a data service deployment, you get that kind of help from the dependency management of Ascend. If you do a data flow-based deployment, which a lot of customers choose to do, actually, it means that you would actually have to figure out like some of those dependencies and ensure you deploy those data flows in the right order. And as Sean was just raising his hand, that's actually what we'll be talking about today, because that was the choice that CBG made. And there are reasons for doing that as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you think about data flow dependencies, one analogy I like to use with people sometimes is just think about like if you're building a relational database and you have primary key and foreign key constraints, right? And you're deploying changes, you have to deploy those changes to those tables in a certain order so that you don't violate those constraints in a database. It's a similar concept. You have dependencies between things, you have to deploy them in the right order. It's not an uncommon thing to think about when you're doing automated deployments, but if you do a data flow driven approach, you definitely have to think about that a little bit more, but you get some nice trade-offs with flexibility as well. Of course, you need to choose technology, architecture, and components for your CI/CD strategy. What source control repository? Pretty much everybody is using Git, but I've worked in this industry a long time. I remember using CVS and SVN and maybe even Fossil at one company somewhere along the way. Most people are on Git these days, though. CICD platform. If you're using GitHub, you might just use GitHub Actions, or Circle CI are popular for integrating with GitHub. You may have maybe cloud-based instances of things like Jenkins, or be using your native cloud functionality like Cloud Deploy or things like that in AWS. So you'll obviously choose your CI/CD platform, and then any of the ancillary tooling like Codicy that Sean was just talking about, things to help manage packages, dependencies, and things like that. Of course, you always want to define and document your CI/CD process. I mean, don't just throw it together. It's always good to document it, think about it, and of course, implement it and iterate on it. When you're building this, there's a learning curve on both sides, especially if it's your first time implementing CI/CD. So start small, start with tangible use cases, create your build definitions. Almost every CI/CD platform has a concept of a generic step or task. We will be building some minor glue code. It's not a lot of difficult code, and Sean will speak to that about what he actually had to build to do this with Ascend. And you'll be assembling this together. You'll be testing it, iterating on it. And once you lock your process down and you have it set up, it's pretty much hands-off mostly at that point. So cool. This is the high-level elements of a CI/CD strategy with Ascend. Sean, go ahead. Please take it away.
All righty. So thanks for that, John. So jumping into kind of what our setup is at CBG, as you can imagine, we are getting ramped up with Ascend. We just finished our onboarding process not too long ago. So we wanted to ramp up quickly. So we have multiple developers working in Ascend. And that's why, when John alluded to earlier, we decided to go with data flow deployment. It's because we wanted to ensure our developers didn't collide with each other. Because at CBG, we develop at the speed of thought. We have a great partnership with our business partners, and we're able to conceptualize projects quickly and get them started. And because there's so many moving parts, we needed to ensure that CI/CD was at the heart of our overall operations. As you can see here, we've got two developers. They're working on their data flows, which the artifact that they would download would be a Python file. They'll merge it into Git. And then as you can see, we'll leverage Actions, GitHub Actions to deploy to our different environments. So what that looks like, again, we merge it, our branch into GitHub. Once that's peer reviewed, it'll get merged. The GitHub Actions will fire off and deploy to the destination environment within Ascend, all automatically, all done by the actions. There's, of course, like John alluded to, some dependencies. We'll bring them in via NPM. There's Git, of course. There's binaries. And again, all this together is how GitHub Actions will get, deploy our data flows from each environment. So from dev to non-prod to prod. Okay, on. And what our environment looks like, we're leveraging Ascend to solve many different solutions and problems. We want to stream data into our PostgreSQL instance, into our Redshift instance, and we're keeping everything separate. So we have our Ascend instance in a separate tenant from all of our other tenants. And we accomplish all this with minimal coding because we follow a low code, no code philosophy. So that was another key reason why we decided to partner with Ascend, amongst many other reasons, but low code, no code was definitely a good seller for us. As you can see here, we have a single data flow that could push to Postgres, push to Redshift. And additionally, as you can see in this right here, we can actually push data to an S3 data lake, all using one data flow. So it's really powerful for us.
Sean, I actually see that there were a couple of questions, and there's one in particular I think is kind of relevant here, which is about deploying a bunch of data flows all at once using a GitHub action, right? And I think you're going to show a little bit more of that, but as you do, I think you can mention how you do that. So we'll kind of integrate that into as we continue here.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that in a couple of slides.
Also, we had another question that came up here was, how would you deploy, or how does deploying at the data flow level prevent developers from stepping on each other's toes? I can answer a portion of that. Sean, feel free to jump in here.
Sure.
When you're working on it, so you have different scopes where developers are doing their work, right? You could be working on an individual data flow. You could be working on separate data services in Ascend. Some customers, in the case of CBG, they chose to go on individual data flows. So that means, like, generally speaking, you will actually check out, work on just one data flow and do your development. If someone else happens to work on the same data flow, obviously when you try to merge things together, you're going to catch those issues in your process. When you try to commit and then you see that there are multiple things that are merging into the same branch. That would be true whether you're doing a data service based unit of deployment or a data flow based as well, right? The whole idea of continuous integration is we're integrating eventually into one main branch, which is moving through multiple different lifecycle stages. So, my dev main branch, my UAT or my non-prod main branch, and then my production main branch, right? So if you think of the branching that you do in a development lifecycle where you have branches by developer in some cases, there's a lot of flexibility with how you do this. And one reason we don't actually necessarily always come out at Ascend and give you there's just one way of doing it is companies do sometimes like to tailor this to their specific team, their specific process, the way they think, the way they prefer to work. So when you do it at a data flow level, right, if one person is responsible for developing that data flow and generally nobody else is working on it at the same time, that's a really simple way of thinking about how to keep you from stepping on each other's toes. Just one data flow is owned by one developer at a time. Still, as I said, the continuous integration will keep you from having issues if you have conflicts, merge conflicts from people that are working on the same data flow. But if you think about it to start with, it's just sort of one data flow is one developer, then you don't necessarily have to worry about too many other collisions other than anything with dependencies or things like that. But that's normal when you have multiple people working on a system. So hope that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, you covered pretty much everything that I was going to cover. So thanks for that.
No worries.
All right, let's get into Automating Ascend.io deployments with GitHub Actions. Before we get started, bonus points to anyone that recognizes that screenshot. It's one of my favorite movies. Okay, so prior to bringing Ascend on board, we had a very well-established process for production deployments. As a team, we meet regularly and conduct peer and Amigo reviews. So all of this, the CICD was already baked into our processes. And enforcing these processes allows us to stay nimble. And the goal was to ensure Ascend followed that same methodology. And the outcome was we were able to successfully build a process that leverage our existing methodologies and enforce our cloud tenants. So we got a couple more questions, or one more question. So how do you handle environment-specific variables like connection strings? That's actually a really good question, Mohinder, and it is something we will cover shortly. So I'll move on. So like I alluded to before at the beginning, the Python SDK from Ascend is critical, and actually, it's the basis of what we did with GitHub Actions. We couldn't do anything without this SDK, and it was extremely easy to use. It requires Python 3.8. You can install it via pip. One thing to note, though, it does require access credentials, access key and secret. You can actually get those within the Ascend dashboard, but again, it does require those. You have to pass those either in we don't recommend you store them in the Python file, but it does require them. So we pass them in via our actions, which I'll show you how we do that in a moment. And this SDK, of course, allows you to download all the artifacts needed for source control. And if you haven't seen it, here's a link here. I believe, Leslie, we're going to be providing this PowerPoint at the end of the webinar. So the link is there if you haven't seen it yet. And John's going to give us a little bit more detail on this SDK.
Right. So we talk a lot about Ascend being a declarative model. And actually, one of the ways that you see this the best is when you're using the SDK and you render out your data pipelines, your data flows, your data services as code. Because there you literally see the declarative definition that represents that pipeline as code. So there are kind of two modes that people will use the SDK with. Most of the actions that you can do via the actual UI itself, those are available via the SDK. We call that the low-level API. And the high-level API lets you work more at the declarative level, where you're downloading data services, where you're downloading data flows, rendering that code out. One thing that we always do recommend here is that if you do download, and render out your data flows or your data services, that you don't necessarily go and modify those definitions unless you are doing a code-first development approach where you are building your pipelines programmatically via code. In that case, it makes perfect sense. There is a pattern for developing with Ascend where you do all your development in the UI first, and you download that code, and then you check it into your source control. That is a UI-first development approach. So in that case, you would be using the SDK with the high-level API, downloading and rendering those out as Python files, committing those to source control. And in that specific scenario, we recommend you do not change those rendered data service or data flow definitions. And you don't need to, because you can actually kind of build around them with that little bit of glue code that we were talking about and Sean's about to show and talk about a little more. So the SDK is very powerful. We are constantly improving it and adding to it. Sort of side note, we just released a new release of this, which does have a simplified download template. So this just came out in the last week. So definitely have a look at that. There will be improved and new documentation coming out about some of these new features. We continue to invest in the developer experience around this as well. Also, there will be a command line interface to this SDK that comes with the SDK that'll help with some of these steps where you might have to build a little bit of glue code today, and some of that will eventually become more built into the product as well. So improvements coming in the roadmap around this new release that just came out. Definitely check it out. It simplifies some of those definition files that come out of the high-level API as well. Cool.
So John, do have a question specific to that from Mohinder. How do you make the code first more approachable? It's pretty tough now because the object model is super proto-buffy.
Thanks for teeing that one up for me. So this new version that I was just talking about, it's still somewhat proto-Buffy, but it does put some more generic wrappers around some of the data types and other things like that to try to simplify that. So you have to think about that less. A lot of these things are actually generated from gRPC protobuf definitions. And this is why it's exposed like that. It's very simple for us to actually maintain these interfaces. But the protobuf totally understood. They take a little bit of getting used to. We did add a little bit more wrapping around that to make it easier. So definitely recommend checking out the latest release and the new download templates, and also waiting for the improved docs to come out, which will also help explain more how to do that. Great question, though.
Absolutely, yes. For me, the SDK was very, I found it easy to work with, and my Python level is programming with some Raspberry Pis off and on. But so again, I found it very, very engaging and easy to work with. And
hey,
again,
that's IoT device development. That's very high levels in some people's minds. So,
so let's jump into it. So the Ascend Python use case, which is again data flow deployment. Sorry. Like John alluded to earlier, there are two different methods for deploying artifacts. You've got that data service level and data flow level. And again, we opted to use the data flow deployment because we wanted that flexibility to give our developers, to allow our developers to work in the same data service. To accomplish this, we created 3 Python scripts. We have a download data service, download data flow, and deploy data flow. And what it does is the first one, we download the data service locally to our local desktop. The second one actually downloads the specific data flow that we're working with. Now, this is important because when you download the data service, it'll download all the files, but you have to download the specific data service itself or the data flow itself in order to do that data flow level deployment. Because it downloads, when you do the data flow, it downloads a separate SQL or Python file that isn't downloaded if you just simply download the data service. Once we download that file, use your whatever program you use. I use GitKraken. You merge your branch into GitHub, and then after it's reviewed, again, that's when those actions kick off. Once we create that pull request. So as you can see here on the screenshots, very simple code. You import some basic information, you OSS, you import all the client from the SDK, download data service from the SDK. And again, right there, you see those Ascend access key and Ascend secret key. I'm passing those as variables. So again, make sure that you do not put your access keys in your code and do not merge that into GitHub. I can't begin to tell you how many times I've seen that in repos that I've looked at. And I'm just like, why? Don't do that. Pass them as variables. Keep your keys secure somewhere else. Moving on to the next one. For the CICD structure, as you can see, actions are kicked off by the merge request. So the first Python script downloads the data services from Ascend. It grabs added and updated data flows are pulled and passed to the second Python script. So I think it was Mohinder asked earlier how you can deploy multiple data flows within one merge request. This is how it happens. So as you can see here, the GitHub action will actually grab the changed files from GitHub. So if you have multiple data flows that you modified, that's where it grabs it, and then that's what passes it to our Python script that's going to upload those data flows, and it'll just loop through them. So add updated data flows are pulled and passed to the second Python script. It makes it easier to manage. And if you're using GitHub, there's actually an action secrets section within the settings. So if you have access to that, I highly recommend you keep your access key and your secret key there, because you can call it directly in the action and then pass it to your Python file. So if everything is successful up to that point, the data flows are deployed to the destination environment. Once we finish working, everything's good to go. Our data flows are deployed. Then at the bottom here, there's a notification that'll go to our Teams channel letting us know, hey, everything was successful, everything's great, or not, something happened, we'll have to go and and fix something. And again, this is critical when you have, so it's critical that you have you also include pausing in here, especially if you have two environments that are leveraging the same database. At CBG, we have essentially one database for our dev and non-production environment. So we've baked in pausing into our deployment process. Once that, so say for example, we have the one data flow. It goes from dev into non-prod. After the deployment is successful, it goes back to dev and pauses that development data flow. Because if you don't do that, it will fail spectacularly. I may or may not be speaking from experience. So again, always include pausing if you're leveraging the same database for multiple environments. And one of the benefit of this actually is it will help save on some costs of your EC2 instances. If you've got two data flows running at the same time, you're gonna see a bump in your EC2 costs. So a question from sorry for Niket. Can you please show example of the YAML? Yes, I'm actually going to show you what that looks like. Just a snippet of it actually in the next slide. Thanks for a great question.
But another thing on here too, if you have the filter for changed files and you have dependencies that are complex, right? That would be a good place to evaluate that when you deploy those change things out, that you deploy them in the right order. That if there's a dependency, you deploy those changes in the right way. As I said before about a data flow versus data service, this is where one of the things you need to do is think about like, okay, these are the data flows that got updated, but do I need to deploy the changes that are in there in a certain order? And if you do a data flow level one, you have to think about that a little bit more. I think the other thing we also made a comment here as well is there isn't an explicit testing step on this kind of build process called out. That's mostly because CBG's pipelines are all using mostly native functionality. So kind of as a best practice, right? This isn't just applies to Ascend.io. This applies to basically any technology. You don't necessarily test the platform functionality. What you want to test are either you want to do integration testing of your code with that platform, or you want to do unit testing of your own code. And even though it's not called out explicitly here, in general, when customers ask about testing, with many customers that are doing integration testing and unit testing where they have a lot more complex code, and we do have a whole story around how that works. We are building and we're going to be releasing some more advisory type documentation around how you can do that with Ascend. All the traditional paradigms of testing that you'd expect are all possible. But if you're using mostly native functionality, there isn't necessarily that much to test. Unless you're doing some sort of like integration tests, things like that. So anyways, if you have questions about this, feel free to follow up with us. You know where to reach us. We're happy to share with you some of the patterns that we've seen here as well from other customers and what they've done too.
Awesome. Thanks for that, John. So again, moving right along into the GitHub Actions themselves. As you can see here, it actually is a YAML file that we're leveraging for our GitHub Actions. We're able to do a number of different things, not just deploy data flows with these actions. We're able to scan it with Bandit, making sure that everything is secure. We can use our linters to make sure that our Python code is accurate as well. And like you mentioned before, you can pass through variables from the actions themselves. You can pass in your keys. You can pass in just about anything to these Python files. One of the things I wanted to touch on, though, is one of the challenges that I had is determining what was the source environment and which was the destination environment when I was doing data deployment at that data flow level. And what I aligned on was to differentiate between the different environments, actually using the environment we were merging into in GitHub. So whether it be our development environment from a feature branch going to develop, or develop going to main, I pass that directly into the Python file. So I know, okay, if I'm going from my feature branch into develop, I know I'm going from dev to non-prod. And passing that into the Python file, I was able to just say, hey, yep, I'm going to non-prod. Here's my data service. I'm going to tack on _dev onto that, or _non-prod under that. And then that's where my deployment was going, or my data flow was going to. And again, like I mentioned before, keep your keys in the secret actions or secure actions within GitHub. Can't stress that enough. And lastly,
go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go.
I was going to say, just to reiterate that, what you said there, that based on what branch you're committing to, right, and which branch you're coming from and which branch you're going to, you can determine which ascend target that you need to go and deploy against, right? So you can think of it as being like your non-prod branch is tied to the deployment for your non-prod data service.
Yep.
If you're doing it across multiple ascend environments where you have different clusters, it's the same idea. It's just you're changing the name of the cluster that you're deploying to usually. So think of it as the branch that you're merging into is equivalent to what will be deployed to that target in ascend as well.
Absolutely. So moving right along, actually, we're going to jump into some key takeaways and lessons learned. I cannot stress how great it was to work with John and the people at Ascend. They embody the people first culture. And for us at CBG, that was really one of the key selling points and why we wanted to partner with them. And one of the reasons why I'm here is because their philosophy pretty much aligns with ours. You know, we want to build our businesses, but we want to start with that people first culture. And again, going into the SDK gives you a ton of flexibility to do a number of different things with your environments. At CBG, we try to differentiate our admin users from our developers. None of our developer accounts or users should have what we call that God mode access. So we recommend you maintain an admin user that's separate from your regular users and assign your developers, the data admin role in each data service. That'll make sure that, no one's inadvertently either deleting something they shouldn't be or deleting a user or a connection, things like that. You want to make sure you keep that user that is able to do all that separate.
I think that's referred to generally in the security circles as the principle of least privilege, right?
Yes, absolutely. And again, we want to make sure that we build a process to pause your source data flow and your GitHub Actions to avoid collisions, because it is spectacular. I think, John, you mentioned that it'll go into some kind of infinite loop. If that were
right. So one of the things that if you see this behavior, if you have multiple write connectors in Ascend that are writing to the same exact source, it produces a somewhat confusing behavior, which is that basically one will try to write, if they literally try to write at the same exact moment, one will write and the other one will write, and they'll basically start fighting with each other. So this especially happens if you have, let's say, your dev and your non-prod. The ultimate best practices, if you have enough budget to do it, and if you're an organization of a size where you can do this, is to separate all of the dependencies for your development into one environment. In other words, if I have a couple databases and some buckets, have an entirely separate copy for dev and an entirely separate copy for non-prod. But there are reasons for cost savings or other things like that, or simplicity. Sometimes with data lakes, you might share one section of that data lake between your dev and non-prod because you just don't want to keep duplicating your data over and over again. So if you have that scenario, in order to prevent, as basically Sean's been saying, if you have two write connectors trying to write to the same location, if you pause, like say your dev flows after you've deployed, after you're done making changes, right? If you need to unpause it and test something, you can always go into the UI and unpause it and do some testing. This gives you kind of two benefits. One is that you don't run into this problem where you're trying to write to the same table or the same output location in S3 from two different data flows, one in dev, one in non-prod. It helps with that problem, but it also helps you save some money too. Like, who wants to leave their development flow running all the time, right? Like, you may not. So if you want to save on that cost, pause it when you're done working with it. And in this case, CBG chose to build that into their process right away. So when it's done, you've deployed, you've migrated, it's paused, and you save money. You don't run things that you don't need to.
Absolutely. It's interesting. You can actually look, you go to the billing dashboard in AWS, you can see development days. We have a spike in our EC2 costs. And then we're going to end off with lessons learned. Needless to say, our journey with Ascend hit some bumps, some pretty significant ones. And thankfully, John and team were there every step of the way to help us right the ship. So, Mohinder, going into your question from a little bit ago, you got to ensure the connections or credentials use the same name in each environment. And that was, I'd have to say, the biggest lesson that I learned. Being able to do that data flow deployment between different environments. When you do that deployment, if that credential or if that connection is not there, your GitHub action will explode spectacularly. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on when I was going from dev to non-prod. It wasn't working. I'm like, everything looks fine. It should be working. And it wasn't. It was because I didn't have the right connection. So again, when you're working on developing your infrastructure, like John alluded to earlier, you want to make sure that you think what your names are going to use. And in our cases, a lot of our names for our environments are more geek centric, some following different games and whatnot. So we just essentially use those same names depending on which environment we were going to. So we have one tenant for our Postgres installation, another one for our Redshift cluster. We just took that same name and just appended dev, non-prod, and prod and that's our data service name. So we created those data services. We created the connections required to hit those those tenants. Once we have that established, deploying from service to service, it became easy.
Yeah, I might even drill a little bit into that one just for 1 second, just a little further too. Like very specific example, if you have your dev data service and your non-prod data service, and you have a database and you call it, I'll just say it's named MySQL, right? The name of the connection, MySQL connection, right? That's what you named it because you're not very creative or something. I'm just kidding. MySQL connection. If the name of the connection is the same between that dev data service and your non-prod one, what's changing between those two connections? You make two separate connection objects with the same name. Same with the credentials, the same name. And those basically are associated to the data service. So the only thing that has to change is the content of that connection, like the actual connection string. So all your code is just looking for MySQL connection. But depending on which data service you're in, the connection itself is pointing at a different database or different location. Same thing for going from non-prod to prod. So if you use a standard naming convention that's the same in every data service, or even across multiple Ascend clusters, then you know that all you need to do is move that code over, and there's really not necessarily any other change you would have to make. So conventions are really important here to simplify and streamline that.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Mohinder, to answer your question regarding pausing, yes, it's in the SDK. And for our solution, it's in our data flow deployment Python file. Once we successfully deploy those data flows to the new environment, then it just loops through. There's a loop that occurs after that pauses each of the components within the data flow individually. So it's actually pretty fun. You can have the Ascend dashboard up, see your GitHub Actions going, take a look at the data flow, and then you just see the little pause icon pop up in each one, and you're done. So yeah, yes, it's definitely in there, and for me, very cool to watch. The last lesson that I learned: develop or limit your queries when you're developing. When I first started, we started with one of our larger databases that has many millions of records in it, and I didn't limit the query. So each iteration of this test pulled 6-7 million records. That's going to kill your DFCs. So when you're developing new different data flows and working with different read connectors, just limit the query. Pull 100, 1,000, however many you need to make you feel confident that your data set looks fine. But don't select all. Don't do what I did. And lastly, again, don't be afraid to think outside the box. The flexibility of Ascend, read and transform, and even the right connectors allow you to create customized data flows that can serve multiple purposes. Like I showed you in the screenshot earlier, we have one data flow that's taking eligibility data from a source system, pushing it to a PostgreSQL database, pushing it to a Redshift cluster, and actually creating an S3 data lake in S3. We have one data flow solving 3 different problems for us. So again, think outside the box, do whatever you can, and just break it if you want to. You can do, the possibilities are limitless when you're streaming data with Ascend.
I was going to jokingly say, I think sometimes the possibilities are so limitless that actually is what causes people to be confused too. It's like there are multiple ways to solve things, and you can tailor this to the way you need to solve it in your organization. So don't be frightened by that. Like we're giving you the power of a programmable platform. That's pretty catchy. Power of a programmable platform. I like that. I just came up with that. No, I'm just kidding. I did see a question from Mohinder actually about the environment variables and how do you handle the differences in environment variables. I mean, Sean, I think basically one general statement I can make about this is think of a bunch of metadata. When you say, again, terminology, naming things, right? When you say the word environment, right? But what does environment really mean? Right. Well, typically what it means is you give it a name, right? Like development, right? It's the development environment. It's the non-prod environment. And then there's a bunch of metadata associated with that name, right? So if we get really, really specific, right? The environment could be a key that you have in an environment variable, right? And when you look at that environment variable, you know, right? If that environment variable is set, that means these connections, these connection strings, these settings, right? The metadata associated with that environment, these credentials and things of that nature. So in that regard, an environment is a group of configuration settings that you apply to your code and to your platform as you move and migrate from one lifecycle stage to the next. That's what an environment really ultimately is. So, so how to handle those, think of them as being individual settings that you can store in a key vault, that you can use conventions and things like that to associate sensitive values or the GitHub secrets like you were talking about, and associate with this name, right? Or this key in your environment variable that says, this is my dev environment, and these are my connections for my dev environment, and so on and so on. So hopefully that helps a little bit. It's think about your environments like a set of metadata or configuration settings that go along with that environment. And I think that will help in kind of how you conceptualize it.
That definitely helps. There's another question from Aniket regarding the data flow deployments. So Aniket, we do recommend, we employ data flow deployment. And you do it sequentially, like John alluded to earlier. If there's 2 data flows that you want to deploy and they have dependencies, you have to make sure that you deploy the one data flow first that has a dependency that data flow 2 needs. That's the only caveat when you're at the data flow deployment level. So definitely, but you can do as many data, if you're working on 3 different data flows, the process that we came up with will deploy all 3 of them in sequence, again, using those GitHub actions.
Yeah, and part of the question says to avoid load or something like that. It's not specifically to avoid load that you're doing this. I mean, at the end of the day, if you make changes to your code and you deploy it, Ascend is going to see those changes and it's going to need to rerun, right? So you might think if you were deploying it, when you deploy something, Ascend does look and difference whatever you're deploying against what's already deployed. And if it sees that it hasn't changed, you won't trigger any reprocessing. The only things that will change are the things that actually changed and need to be reprocessed. So it's not like you redeploy a single data flow or even like a whole data service, for example, if you're using that deployment model and everything's going to reprocess, it's just going to reprocess the things that have changed. So I don't think it's specifically to avoid extra load. That's not the reason for doing data flows. It's more about just the unit of work that somebody's working on, so that you can have them say, I'm working on just this small piece of the system in isolation and then deploying it out, basically. I think that's the main reason why you do the data flow side.
Absolutely.
Sean, I think we're getting close to the top of the hour. We got one really good summary kind of question here, I think.
So yeah, from Mark, what would I do differently today? Well, I have a tendency to ice skate uphill. And when we first started, we started with a data flow that probably should have been left for last. It was a very complex data flow that, I'll be honest, John did most of the work. When we first onboarded, it was a RX claims data flow. My recommendation, or what I would have done differently, is I would have started with a little bit a smaller data flow, an easier data flow, but just streaming data from one point A to point B, learning how Ascend works, learning through all of the different nuances on data service, data flow, and all the different right connectors. But again, I would definitely have started with something a little bit smaller if I could go back and do it again.
Yeah, I have to echo and I'm not just talking about at Ascend, I'm talking about anywhere I've ever worked. CICD is not a project, it is a journey. Especially when you start getting large systems that are automated, that are extremely complex. I mean, you should see what the CI/CD process looks for the Ascend platform itself. It's non-trivial, it's complicated. So it's really good advice. Start out with something small, learn the ins and outs. There, you will hit a point where you're like, okay, I kind of understand the patterns here. Not necessarily a bad thing that you hit your head on the first try too, because it's like, hey, you hit some of the complexity and you addressed it sooner. So, okay, you just get some Tylenol and maybe a bigger hammer, right? But no, but it's true. Start small and work incrementally. That's why the earlier I had in the slide there too. Think incrementally. You're going to improve the process over time. You're going to get new scenarios that you need to take into account, and you'll keep tweaking it. This is part of the reason, in all truth, absolute truth, this is part of the reason we don't have a out of the box, one size fits all solution for this, because frankly, CI/CD is usually tailored to the organization, the people that work there, the culture, the specific resources and systems you have available, the way people work. I'm not sure it's a thing that there should be a one size fits all approach for it. And it's complicated too. So we give you the tools, we give you the flexibility. We're here to help you, to support you through that. Sean, it's our honor to be helping and working with you while we bang this out and make this fit your organization too. So
amazing journey.
Yeah, so we have, this is what we do as engineers, right? We come together, we work on hard problems, we have fun while we're doing it. So, CI/CD is a journey. We come along on that journey with Ascend and CI/CD. That's what we're here for.
I definitely took the scenic route, that's for sure.
Cool. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour. Yes, we will definitely certainly share a recording of this presentation, so no need to worry about that. Thanks for that question. Anybody else have any other questions? No other questions. Sean, we gave them so much information.
We did. Well, thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining. You know where we are. Sean and CBG, everyone at CBG, we love working with you. Thank you so much for joining us and being willing to share this. We'll make sure the slides and the videos and everything are available for you guys to download later. So everybody have a great rest of your day. Thank you again, Sean. Really appreciate sharing this with everyone. And we'll talk to you soon, everybody.
Take care.